The baptism party was drawing to a close when my mother-in-law insistently demanded that I pay the entire bill. I managed a calm smile. Was this child even mine? Why on earth should I be the one to pay? The celebration was buzzing with laughter. I stood in the middle of the luxurious hall, surrounded by relatives and friends, but my heart felt like a block of ice. My mother-in-law, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, slid the $20,000 bill toward me, hurrying me to settle it under the expectant gazes of the entire family. I smiled. It was a serene smile, so serene it was unsettling. Then, I spoke loudly enough for those at our table to hear. This child is not mine. Why should I be the one to pay? It was at that exact moment that the entire charade shattered, giving way to a dramatic turn of events in Manhattan's grandest seafood restaurant. That evening, the atmosphere had been incredibly lively. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, and soft music created the perfect cover for a supposedly warm family celebration. On a small stage under golden lighting, ornate letters gleamed. Though the parents' names were absent, the inscription caught everyone's eye, a proud declaration from my husband's family. Lorraine, my mother-in-law, was dressed today in an elegant, deep red velvet suit, adorned with a lustrous pearl necklace. Seated in the most prominent spot at the central table, she possessively held a newborn wrapped in a soft silk blanket. Her face glowed, a smile never leaving her lips as she continuously accepted greeting cards containing cash and checks from relatives, friends, and even my own work colleagues. She accepted the money with effusive delight, deftly stashing the envelopes into the designer handbag resting beside her, all while showering the givers with cunning and sweet thank yous. I sat 2 chairs away from her, trying to eat a piece of baked halibut I had placed on my plate, but the food wouldn't go down. In the 5 years since I had married into the Sterling family, I had always maintained a respectful demeanor, tending to every meal and ensuring the peace of my husband's family, never once raising my voice or complaining. The delay in having children had always been a thorn in my mother-in-law's side, a recurring theme at family dinners. But today, Lorraine was incredibly kind to me, insisting I eat the most nourishing dishes, projecting an image of harmony between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law for the numerous guests. Just as only cold appetizers remained on the tables and people began to rise to leave, a young waiter in a flawless uniform approached our table. With both hands, he carried a small wooden tray holding a long bill clipped to it. He bowed respectfully to Julian, my husband. Julian glanced at the bill. His expression shifted slightly, and he quickly looked away, toward his mother. Lorraine understood the hint and immediately reached out to take the check holder. She scanned it and saw the final sum. Without flinching, she pushed the wooden tray toward me, raising her voice just enough for the relatives at the same table to hear. Lorraine spoke to me in her usual condescending tone, telling me to get my card and quickly pay at the register because the guests were leaving and the restaurant needed to close. Furthermore, she emphasized that I had invited many friends and colleagues today, and the gift money was surely substantial. My covering the cost of this celebration was perfectly natural to uphold the family's status and prestige. The total on the bill was exactly $20,000, a considerable sum for a baptism party adorned with all manner of expensive seafood. I didn't raise a hand to take the tray. I sat with my back straight, my eyes scanning the face of each person at the table. My husband's eldest uncle, his younger aunt, and several cousins froze, their expectant gazes fixed on me. Julian turned away, pretending to look at something on his phone to avoid my eyes. I took a deep breath, suppressing years of bitterness, and managed a soft but icy smile. I looked directly into my mother-in-law's eyes and enunciated every word clearly. I asked Lorraine why I should be paying for this banquet when this child was not my son. As soon as I finished speaking, it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the space around our table. The restaurant's buzz seemed to recede, replaced by a frightening, deathly silence in the exact zone where the Sterling family sat. The smile on Lorraine's lips vanished, her face turning to stone. Her eyes widened, filled with astonishment and rage. She opened her mouth to reprimand me, but it was as if a lump had formed in her throat, and she couldn't utter a single word. Just then, a young woman emerged from the corridor leading to the restrooms. She wore a simple white dress, her hair loose to her shoulders, and in her hand, she held a baby bottle with the last remnants of formula. It was Claire, Julian's former work colleague. Her appearance at that very moment was like a slap of fate, shattering the perfect performance my husband's family had tried to stage. Claire stopped in her tracks, sensing the tension in the air. She looked at Lorraine in confusion, then her eyes darted around, searching for Julian, pleading for help. A murmur went through the relatives. Uncle Robert, the wealthiest elder in the family, nudged his wife with his elbow, pointing from Claire to the baby in Lorraine's arms. Everyone started putting two and two together. The fact that a woman with no apparent connection was heading directly toward the infant with a bottle, combined with my recent words, instantly revealed the child's true identity. This was no son of distant friends, as my mother-in-law had broadcast to everyone for weeks to gather guests. Julian sat motionless as a statue, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. His clasped hands trembled beneath the table. His head was bowed in shame, and he didn't dare lift it to meet the questioning and judgmental stares of his own family. The cowardly silence of the man who had once sworn eternal love to me was the clearest admission of his guilt. The illusion of a happy family and a model husband officially shattered right in the middle of the celebration, scattering shards of lies. I calmly stood up and picked up my handbag. I didn't spare Julian another glance. I walked out of the banquet hall, leaving behind the catastrophe for those who now had to face the consequences of their own greed and selfishness. As the taxi pulled away from the restaurant, and I watched the lights of the New York City streets blur past the window, my heart was surprisingly calm. There were no tears, no screams, no despair. Perhaps it was because I had long been mentally prepared for this day. Or perhaps it was because the love I once felt for Julian had died the day I discovered the first traces of his betrayal. I closed my eyes, letting my memories rewind to a month ago. Those were the days when my life still flowed serenely in our Brooklyn Heights apartment. To outsiders, it seemed I had a perfect life, a stable job. My husband was a department head at a major advertising agency, and his family belonged to the affluent middle class. Only one thing had always weighed on my soul: the fact that in 5 years, I had not been able to give the Sterlings a grandchild. One weekend evening, Lorraine took a cab from her house in Queens to visit us. That day, she brought a box of artisanal pastries from a high-end bakery in Manhattan, and even went into the kitchen to bake a New York cheesecake, my favorite dessert. Her excessive enthusiasm surprised me slightly. She was usually very critical, always finding fault with my cooking. After dinner, Lorraine sat in the living room and, while peeling an apple, began to tell quiet stories. She recounted how a close friend from her youth had just become a grandmother. This friend's daughter-in-law had done a wonderful job, giving birth to a beautiful boy weighing almost 9 pounds. Then she sighed, looked at my stomach, and said in a sad but pointed voice, wondering aloud when she would finally get to hold her own grandchild. All I could do was lower my head and silently pour her more tea, a mixture of guilt and sorrow churning inside me. But immediately after, Lorraine abruptly changed the subject. She announced with excitement that at the end of the month, her friend's family was organizing a grand baptism party. She asked me to take the day off work early to go with her and Julian to offer their congratulations. She also insisted that I not forget to prepare a congratulatory card with a $1,000 check for the baby's college trust fund so as not to lose face. Since they were celebrating at a fancy restaurant, giving any less would be an embarrassment to our family. I obediently agreed, suspecting nothing. The real suspicions began to form 3 days later. That day, Julian came home very late. He walked in, looking tired, his shirt wrinkled. As I approached to take his briefcase, a strange scent hit me. It wasn't the strong perfume of another woman, typical of stories about infidelity. And it wasn't the smell of alcohol from a business dinner. It was a sweet, cloying scent with a hint of cleanness, the smell of baby cream and powder. It assaulted my senses. Why would a grown man working in an office smell like a newborn? When I asked him about it, Julian flinched and avoided my gaze. He quickly and smoothly fabricated an excuse, saying he had stopped by the hospital during the day to visit a subordinate's wife who had just given birth, and the smell of baby powder must have clung to him. The reason was very plausible, but a wife's intuition told me something was wrong. A woman's intuition is sharper than any detector. In the following days, I secretly observed Julian. He frequently used overtime as an excuse and had hushed phone conversations on the balcony. Most importantly, a large hole appeared in our monthly expenses that he couldn't coherently explain. But the decisive piece of evidence, which completely destroyed my last drop of trust, was an incredibly foolish oversight by my husband's family. One Sunday morning, Lorraine called me over to her house to help clean before a family lunch. While wiping the floor near the coffee table in the living room, I accidentally dislodged a black plastic bag from under the sofa. The bag was full of the small favor boxes used to give gifts to guests at a baptism. Out of curiosity, I opened it. Among the empty boxes lay stickers that had not yet been applied. They were cream-colored paper with gold embossed letters. I picked one up, and my eyes locked onto each letter. The text read, "In celebration of the baptism of Alexander, grandson of the Sterling family, accompanied by a date of birth that matched the age of the child whose party Lorraine was supposedly attending." My hands trembled. Grandson of the Sterling family. My husband's last name. There was no close friend, no friend's grandson. This child bore the Sterling name. And it was this family that was preparing for the baptism and had been preparing these labels for a long time. I sank to the cold floor, piecing all the facts together. The smell of baby cream on Julian's shirt. Lorraine's unusual generosity. The fact that I was being pushed to prepare a cash gift to attend a baptism at a seafood restaurant. These were not disparate events, but a carefully orchestrated performance, a large-scale conspiracy to deceive me. They wanted to trap me, to force me to attend the party so that I would somehow be compelled to accept the existence of this illegitimate son. They took it for granted that with my patient and submissive nature, along with the pressure of being unable to have children for 5 years, I would swallow it all and agree to raise the child to preserve my status as a wife and daughter-in-law. But they were wrong. I can be kind, but I am certainly not a fool to let others trample on my self-respect. From the moment I held that sticker in my hand, I decided not to cry. I would play along until the very end of this farce to see just how far they were willing to go. Returning to the evening of the baptism party, unlike the gloomy face Lorraine expected from a daughter-in-law forced to attend a stranger's celebration, I had applied my makeup perfectly and wore an elegant dress, arriving at the restaurant an hour before the appointed time. Upon entering the grand lobby, a huge, elaborately designed banner caught my eye. Against a backdrop of a blue sky with white clouds and children's toys, large, ornate letters stood out, exactly matching the text I had seen on the sticker at my mother-in-law's house. They made no effort to hide their pride in the Sterling bloodline. Julian, my husband, stood in the reception area in an elegant suit with a flower in his lapel, busy giving instructions to the waiters, rearranging floral arrangements, and adjusting the stage lighting. His behavior was no different from that of a father overflowing with happiness on his child's big day. He looked nothing like a guest. Seeing me, Julian flinched for a moment. He hurried over, trying to force a strained smile, and explained that Lorraine had asked him to come early to help her friend's family oversee the arrangements. I nodded, smiling, not exposing his clumsy lie. I praised him for being so thoughtful and walked inside. Lorraine was sitting on the waiting chairs with my sister-in-law, Janice. Both were busy organizing the reception table, preparing to collect the congratulatory cards and trust fund checks. Seeing me, Lorraine immediately stood up, grabbed my arm, and led me straight to the main doors of the restaurant, ordering me to stand at the reception point for guests. She said that she had invited many of my old friends, as well as current colleagues, to join the celebration. She assigned me the task of smiling and graciously escorting my guests to tables 3 and 4. She particularly stressed that I should take the initiative to collect the gift cards and checks from my friends. Afterward, I was to gather them and give them to Janice for safekeeping. And at the end of the evening, she herself would hand them over to the friend's family. I froze on the spot, feeling nauseated by my mother-in-law's audacity. It turned out her goal in dragging me into this farce was not only to force me to accept the child, but also to use my social connections in my name to invite people to the party to collect money in envelopes. They had turned me into the perfect screen to hide the sordidness of a child born out of wedlock, and, simultaneously, a tool to recoup the costs of the lavish party they had thrown. They had calculated, down to the last penny, the money from my friends, forcing me into a debt of gratitude with my colleagues in exchange for putting on a show for the sake of their grandson. As I stood there greeting my friends with a fixed smile on my lips, a familiar hand suddenly pulled me into the internal staff corridor. It was Anna, my best friend from college, who now worked as the manager of this very restaurant. She looked around with an intensely stressed expression. She pressed on my shoulders to make me lean in and whispered quietly but with complete resolve. Anna revealed the whole truth about the banquet bill. She said the Sterling family had chosen the most expensive menu at the restaurant, including Alaskan king crab, oysters, and premium imported wines. The total cost for 10 tables was nearly $20,000. But the most horrifying part was that when dealing with the cashier earlier in the day, my husband had instructed the staff that the family had not yet made a deposit and that later, when the party ended, they were to bring the total bill to his wife for her to pay with her card. Hearing this, I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything was clear. A perfect financial trap had been set, waiting for me to fall into it. They wanted to squeeze every last drop out of me, to make me acknowledge my husband's illegitimate son, to use my friends to collect money, and finally, to force me to empty my years of savings to pay for a celebration of his infidelity. They didn't see me as a person, a daughter-in-law, or a wife, but merely a money-making machine and an obedient puppet. Anna squeezed my hand. Her eyes were full of concern and anger on my behalf. She warned me that under no circumstances should I give in to weakness and that I absolutely must not take out my bank card to pay. Anna also promised that she would remind the service staff to bring the bill at the precise moment it would put the most pressure on my husband's family. I took a deep breath and nodded, thanking Anna. The handshake from my best friend gave me strength. I straightened my dress, lifted my head, and walked out of the dark corridor back into the brightly lit lobby. I would play the role of a polite guest until the curtain fell on this farce. I would wait for the final moment, the moment I would flip the chessboard they had so carefully arranged. At that moment, I would show them the price to be paid for daring to disregard a woman's dignity. I walked with a firm stride across the restaurant's gleaming tiled floor. The distance from where I stood to the exit was only a few dozen yards, but it felt like I was crossing a border between two lives. Behind me lay the wreckage of a false family, and ahead was the atmosphere of freedom I so desperately craved. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard the sound of chairs being pushed back and hurried footsteps pursuing me. Julian's hand roughly grabbed my forearm, yanking me back. The force of the pull was such that the handbag on my shoulder slipped off, hitting the edge of a nearby table. Julian's face was contorted, red with a mixture of anger and extreme panic. He growled, trying to keep his voice low so the surrounding guests wouldn't notice, and asked what madness I was creating. Was I going to ruin this family's reputation? I coldly wrenched my arm free. I looked with a dagger-like gaze at the sweaty face of the man I once called my husband. I reached into my bag, pulled out the congratulatory card with the $1,000 check my own mother-in-law had forced me to prepare days ago. I threw the card forcefully onto the glass table, making a dry thud. I enunciated every word, stating that I came here today as a guest to the baptism of an acquaintance's child. The $1,000 was a gift, exactly as his mother had demanded. As for the $20,000 bill, whoever enjoyed this lavish banquet could pay for it out of their own pocket. I had no obligation to pay for his infidelity. Having said that, I snatched my card back from the table, turned and walked away decisively, leaving Julian petrified on the spot. In the distance, Lorraine began to scream scandalously. Her insults echoed behind me, but they couldn't stop my steps. Anna, the manager, stood by the cashier, looking at me and nodding encouragingly. I smiled a farewell to my friend and walked out through the automatic glass doors, disappearing into the rush-hour crowd on the streets of Manhattan. When I returned to our family apartment in Brooklyn Heights, everything was as clean and tidy as when I had left. But now the space felt cold and utterly foreign to me. I didn't turn on the living room lights, just a small yellow lamp on a side table, and brewed myself a cup of hot chamomile tea. I sat silently on the sofa, listening to the ticking of the clock in the empty night. My mind was perfectly clear. I didn't shed a single tear. When pain exceeds a tolerable limit, a person becomes frighteningly calm. Around 11 p.m., a key turned in the lock. Julian entered, looking more pathetic than ever before. The elegant jacket from the day was gone. His tie was loosened and askew. His clothes were wrinkled. He reeked of cigarette smoke and the sour smell of alcohol. Seeing me sitting in the dark corner, Julian flinched. He took a step back and then quickly changed his demeanor, running a hand over his face in a gesture of great sorrow. Julian shuffled over and plopped onto the sofa opposite me, burying his head in his hands and beginning his litany of complaints. He used a low, sorrowful tone to explain that everything that had happened today was involuntary. He swore to heaven and earth that there was only one wife in his heart, and it was me. The fact that he had a child with Claire, a former colleague, was an absolute and unwanted accident. At a company party, he had had too much to drink and lost control. He said that Claire had used the child to blackmail him, forcing his mother to arrange the party to introduce her to the family, but that he himself never wanted this scandal to reach my ears. He begged me to open my heart, to have pity on the foolishness of a man who had made a mistake, and to give him a chance to fix everything and atone for his guilt. I continued to sit, taking a sip of the now cool tea, letting Julian play his part. I waited until he had spewed all his cheap lies, then slowly opened the desk drawer and took out a small piece of paper, neatly wrapped in clear plastic. I walked over to Julian and tossed the paper onto the glass coffee table. In the dim yellow light, the gold letters shone dazzlingly. In celebration of the baptism of Alexander, grandson of the Sterling family, accompanied by the child's date of birth. I looked directly at Julian's face, which was gradually turning pale, and enunciated every word. I asked him if his drunken accident was truly an accident of such a mystical nature. A child needs 9 months to be born, yet he dared to blame it on a recent drunken night. Even worse, the labels for the gift boxes had been ordered by his family 2 months ago and carefully hidden under the sofa in his mother's house. I asked if one drunken night when he lost control could have spawned a 9-month pregnancy and an entire detailed plan, from ordering gifts and labels to compiling a guest list to extract money from his wife's friends. Julian's face turned as white as chalk, as if he had just been slapped. His lips trembled in an attempt to say something, but a bitter lump formed in his throat, and he couldn't utter a single coherent word. The blatant proof before his eyes had demolished all his pathetic excuses. The clumsy lies were brutally exposed, forcing Julian to bow his head to his knees, not daring to lift it to look at me for even another second. I gave a mocking smile, took back the sticker, turned around, and went straight to the bedroom, locking the door with the deadbolt. Tonight, I would sleep soundly to prepare for what I had to do tomorrow. The next morning, a light drizzle fell over New York, typical for late spring. The fresh air was very pleasant, replacing the sadness and gloom characteristic of a woman who has just discovered her husband's infidelity. I got up at 6:00 a.m., washed my face, tied my hair into a neat bun, and applied a cheerful terracotta lipstick. I took my usual basket and walked to the farmer's market not far from home. The bustling atmosphere, the sounds of women haggling who had come to the market early in the morning, gave me a strange sense of reality and peace. I went to a trusted grocer and carefully selected the best ingredients for a classic chicken soup: a plump, free-range chicken, fresh organic vegetables, and savory herbs. Back in the kitchen, I put everything into a large pot with water and let it simmer on low heat. After an hour of simmering, the comforting aroma of hearty chicken soup filled the small kitchen, radiating a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the coldness of my current marriage. I poured it into a thermal container to keep it warm. I changed into more formal clothes and called a taxi to go directly to my mother-in-law's house. Lorraine's house was located deep in the streets of Queens. When I entered the yard, carrying the still-steaming pot of chicken soup, Lorraine was sitting on the sofa in the living room, combing her hair. At the sight of me, a shadow of fear and confusion flickered across her face. She probably took it for granted that after yesterday's scandal at the restaurant, I would be screaming, crying, packing my bags to go to my parents, or making a scene demanding a divorce. She could not have imagined that I would appear with a meek and gracious demeanor, bringing her food to help her recover, exactly as if nothing had happened. I gently placed the pot on the table, took a bowl and a ladle. I poured a small portion, offering it to Lorraine to try while it was hot. I told her that the weather had been chilly lately, and that a warm meal is always comforting. So I had taken the trouble to prepare this homemade chicken soup for her to lift her spirits. Lorraine suspiciously took the bowl from my hands. Her prying eyes darted continuously over my face. After eating 2 spoonfuls, she began to clear her throat, trying to regain her usual authority as a mother-in-law to steer the conversation as she wished. Lorraine set the bowl aside, clicked her tongue, sighed, and began her prepared speech. She used the confidential tone of older, worldly-wise women, advising me that as a woman, I should know how to sacrifice, how to endure for the good of the family. She mentioned that we had been married for 5 years and my belly was still flat, using this as the most logical justification for all her son's sins. She argued that a prominent family like the Sterlings needed a grandson to carry on the family name and legacy. And the fact that Julian had committed this folly was driven solely by the desire to have a son to continue the family line. She confidently stated that this Claire was merely an instrument for childbearing. Later, their family would give her a sum of money to marry someone else, and the child, in whom the Sterling blood flowed, would be left for me to raise. She told me to be magnanimous and accept the baby, to care for him from infancy, and then, when he grew up, he would consider me his real mother. The family would once again be happy and peaceful, just as before. I listened attentively to every word of my mother-in-law's sophistry, maintaining a faint smile on my lips and showing no resistance or anger. I waited until she had finished speaking. I poured myself a glass of water and then spoke with deliberation. I told Lorraine that I held in my heart all the guidance she had given me and that posterity was certainly an important matter for the family. However, the important thing now was not who would raise the child, but what I should tell my friends and work colleagues. I gently told her that this morning when I woke up, my phone was flooded with countless messages from colleagues at the office. They were asking if yesterday's celebration went well and especially wanted to know if her friend's family had received the full amount of the gift money they had given through me. I was put in an awkward position. I didn't know what to answer them to be appropriate. Seeing that I mentioned neither scenes of jealousy nor divorce, but was only concerned with social connections, Lorraine seemed to have a weight lifted from her shoulders. She breathed a sigh of relief, thinking she had found my weakness. I took this opportunity to ask the crucial question. I asked, "Yesterday at the restaurant, I gave all my guests' envelopes to Janice for safekeeping. So, is the ledger where the trust fund checks were recorded and all the gift cards now with you or with Janice? I need it to copy the list. That way, in the future, when they have an event, I'll know how to repay the favor." Lorraine suspected nothing and answered quickly. She said that during the payment at the restaurant yesterday, there was a big commotion, her head hurt, and she left in a taxi. Before that, all the checks collected at the party and the ledger with the names of the donors she had given to Janice, Julian's sister, to take to her house, count, and keep. I nodded, feigning understanding, and asked for permission to collect the dishes to take to the kitchen and wash. The goal of that morning was achieved too easily. Confirming who exactly had that damned notebook was an important turning point for carrying out the next step of my plan. To expose these greedy and hypocritical people. When I left Lorraine's house, the sky had cleared. The sun's rays glistened on the wet asphalt. After leaving Lorraine's, I took a taxi and, instead of returning home, went straight to a familiar coffee shop near a park. I chose a quiet corner, ordered an iced black coffee to keep my mind clear. I unlocked my phone, opened the Messenger app, and found Janice's contact. My sister-in-law, known throughout the Sterling family for her calculating nature and extreme greed. I composed a very polite and respectful message to send her. The content of the message expressed shame for what happened last night at the restaurant, which had put the family in a bad light. Then, I cleverly inserted the pretext that several colleagues from the accounting and HR departments at my job were asking about the money gifted at the baptism. I cited my poor memory and the fact that I wouldn't know how to handle social obligations in the future. Therefore, I earnestly requested that Janice send me photos of the pages of the ledger where the checks from the group of guests I brought were recorded. I also made sure to emphasize that the family could keep the money for expenses. I was only asking for the list of names and amounts to save on my phone and have peace of mind. I sent the message, placed the phone on the table, and took a sip of the bitter coffee. Human psychology is a very strange thing. When someone is unjustly holding a sum of money, they always tend to be very wary, but they easily fall into a panic if you hit them right where it hurts. Janice, a housewife who does nothing but haggle over prices at the market year-round, having over $10,000 in checks and cash from her sister-in-law's friends in her possession, must have made her very nervous. The fact that I sent her a message asking for the list in such a submissive tone should have calmed her, but at the same time, it triggered her haste to demonstrate her false transparency. About 15 minutes later, my phone screen lit up, but the message notification came not in the private chat between Janice and me, but as a barrage in the group chat titled The Sterling Family. It was a group of nearly 40 members, including my mother-in-law, my husband, me, Janice and her husband, and all the uncles, aunts, and cousins of the family from all over the country. I opened the family chat. Janice had just sent a long series of images in succession, surely out of nervousness. Instead of pressing send only to me, she had made a mistake and pressed share in the general family group. I enlarged each photo to examine it. Janice's crooked handwriting was very clear on the lined paper of the ledger. She had made columns and very carefully drawn cells. But the most surprising thing was the headings on the pages of the ledger. She had clearly written in capital letters, "Trust fund donations collected for the baptism. Sterling family grandson, Alexander." Below this heading was a detailed list of names with the corresponding amounts. Many of these names belonged to my friends and colleagues. For example, Marina's accounting department, $2,500. HR department, $1,500. Anna, restaurant manager, Marina's friend, $1,000. Michael Davis, Marina's business partner, $500. In total, the amount collected from my guests was about $10,000. All of it was recorded as income for the so-called grandson of the Sterling family. There was not a single note about returning this money to the friend's family, as Lorraine had trumpeted. It only took a few minutes for the family group members to digest the enormous amount of information from these photos. The group chat immediately exploded like a marketplace. A series of messages began to pop up on the screen at a dizzying speed. The first and most vehement reaction was from Aunt Carol, a distant relative who lived right next door to Lorraine's house. Aunt Carol was known for her direct nature and had resented my mother-in-law's hypocrisy for years. She wrote a long message, directly exposing the shamelessness of her cousin's family. Aunt Carol wrote without mincing words, asking everyone in the group since when did the Sterling family have the audacity to pocket the blood, sweat, and tears of their daughter-in-law's colleagues to enrich an illegitimate son. She criticized the act of using my connections to collect money in envelopes as an act of disgusting hypocrisy, tarnishing the good name of the Sterling ancestors. Aunt Carol's harsh words acted like gasoline poured on a fire. Other uncles and aunts from the family began to join the comments. Some were horrified, not understanding what was happening. Others directly tagged Lorraine's and Julian's accounts in the group, demanding clear explanations. One uncle from out of state even cursed foully, saying that with a reputation as a respectable family in New York, to commit such a despicable act, deceiving their own daughter-in-law and stealing money from guests, how could they now face their relatives back in their hometown? Janice, overcome with panic, tried to delete the photos, but it was too late. The Messenger app gave an error due to network delay. The images with the evidence had already been saved to the phones of dozens of relatives. Lorraine and Julian completely disappeared. No one dared to say a single word in the group chat, which was seething with indignation. I leaned back in my chair, silently turned off my phone screen, letting the device vibrate furiously in my bag. A feeling of satisfaction mixed with peace spread throughout my body. So, the irrefutable proof of my mother-in-law's and sister-in-law's bottomless greed had come to light, not by my hand, but through their own foolishness and pettiness. The Sterling family's mask of respectability before their relatives was torn away at the root. I smiled calmly. I waved to the waiter to pay for my coffee, mentally preparing for the next direct confrontation with my husband's mistress. In the afternoon, as I was organizing documents at my desk, my phone vibrated. An unknown number sent me a message, introducing herself as Claire and asking for a meeting. She wrote that she had an extremely important matter concerning the child's future that she needed to discuss directly with me. I thought for a few seconds and replied, giving her the address of a coffee shop in a different neighborhood and demanding that she be on time. I am not in the habit of hiding. Knots tied by people must be untied by the people themselves, face to face. At exactly 4:00 p.m., I entered the coffee shop. Claire was already waiting at a table by the window. Unlike her dazzling appearance in the white dress at the restaurant the day before, today she wore a rather simple house suit. Her makeup-free face showed dark circles from lack of sleep, typical of new mothers. Seeing me, she hastily stood up, wringing her hands, displaying a timid fear. I pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. I ordered an orange juice and then looked at her calmly, waiting for Claire to start crying. She took a tissue from her bag and dabbed the corners of her eyes. In the weak tone of someone playing the victim, she said that she too was just a naive and trusting woman, deceived by Julian's sweet talk. She said she didn't want to destroy my family's happiness, but since the baby was already on the way, she didn't have the heart to have an abortion. Now that the child was born, he needed a clear status. She folded her hands on the table, bowed her head, and begged me to open my heart, to step forward and legally adopt the child so he could have a proper birth certificate with the Sterling last name. I watched the tears roll down Claire's cheeks, feeling not a drop of compassion inside. I asked her directly if she thought it was moral to force a legal wife to adopt her husband's mistress's child as her own. Yes, she had decided to have Julian's child. That meant she and Julian should handle the child's legal documents themselves. Why were they dragging me into this to be a cover for their filth? I had barely finished speaking when the glass door of the coffee shop burst open, and Lorraine stormed in with an extremely hostile face. It was clear that Claire had secretly alerted my mother-in-law to come and apply pressure by making a scene. The mother-in-law and the mistress had united to corner the legal wife. Lorraine pushed a chair aside and sat down heavily next to Claire, patting her on the shoulder in a protective gesture. Lorraine began to threaten me aloud, right there in front of everyone. She said that as a daughter-in-law, I was insane, short-sighted, and stupid for not thinking about the future of my husband's family. She categorically stated that this child was a Sterling grandchild, and whether I agreed or not, she would take him home to raise. She also berated me, saying that if I couldn't give birth, I should know how to step aside for another to provide offspring, and that I should be grateful, not lecture her with such a superior tone. I didn't get angry. I gently stirred the orange juice in front of me, smiling at the two women who were attacking me with such fervor. I knew that the fatal weak spot of this alliance was economic interest. I calmly placed the spoon on the saucer and shifted my gaze to Claire. I asked Claire what the Sterling family had promised her to make her wait obediently with the child at the restaurant yesterday. Hadn't my mother-in-law promised that she would collect all the money from the guests' envelopes to open a savings account for the child as a nest egg? Claire flinched, blinked rapidly, and nodded in confirmation. I sneered contemptuously. I took out my phone and opened the photo of the accounting notebook that Janice had mistakenly sent to the family chat that morning. I pushed the phone toward Claire, telling her to see for herself how nearly $20,000 from yesterday's gift money had been neatly recorded in the Sterling family's expense fund. There was absolutely not a single line mentioning the opening of a savings account for her and her son. Claire's face changed instantly. She turned to look at Lorraine with complete disbelief. Lorraine became flustered, tried to snatch the phone, but I quickly pulled it away. I delivered another blow. I asked Claire if it was true that besides the savings account, Julian had promised her that she and the child would move into a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side so they wouldn't want for anything. Claire bit her lip. Extreme panic began to show in her eyes. I slowly revealed the cruel truth to her. That apartment on the Upper East Side was never Julian's property, but a short-term rental he used to impress her. Last month, he had secretly canceled the lease to pocket the deposit refund for his personal expenses. All those promises of a comfortable home were just castles in the air that Lorraine and her son had used to deceive her, so she would be a mere obedient tool for continuing their lineage and nothing more. Hearing this, Claire completely broke down, covered her face with her hands, and sobbed bitterly. This was no longer the fake crying from before, but the indignation of a person who realized she had been shamelessly deceived. Sitting next to her, Lorraine turned pale, muttering something, unable to form a single coherent sentence in her defense. The temporary alliance between the mother-in-law and the mistress began to crack along its dirty seams. I stood up, left money for the juice on the table, and calmly walked out of the coffee shop to breathe the fresh afternoon air, leaving behind the two women who had begun to turn on each other. At 7:00 p.m., I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard the key turn in the lock. The door opened, and Julian walked in. Unlike his pathetic appearance the previous evening, today he looked as if he had showered, shaved, and was holding a bouquet of red roses. But what drew my attention was not the romance, but how ridiculously cheap it looked. It was a bouquet bought in a hurry from a street vendor. The roses, which were already starting to wilt, were carelessly wrapped in clear cellophane with a few sprigs of cheap plastic baby's breath. The cost of this bouquet surely did not exceed $20. Julian came over, placed the bouquet on the glass table in front of me, and forced a smile that he himself considered affectionate and full of remorse. He sat in the armchair opposite, rubbed his hands, cleared his throat, and began a speech he had probably rehearsed carefully on his way home. Julian, in a warm voice, advised me that the past should be left in the past. He admitted he was wrong to have hidden it from me, but stated that in the eyes of friends, relatives, and colleagues, I was still the legal wife, the sole mistress of this house. He made me a proposal that he said was very reasonable. He wanted me to turn a blind eye to everything, as if I knew nothing, to continue playing the role of a model wife and daughter-in-law, maintaining peace in the house and protecting the tranquility and prestige of both families. In return, he would take care of Claire and the child elsewhere, and would absolutely not allow her to set foot in this house to disturb my life. He thought that way we would both win. I don't lose a husband. He doesn't lose a wife, and the child will have a father who cares for him. Listening to these selfish calculations, I felt nauseous. This man's mentality was truly twisted. He viewed marriage as a commercial transaction where he could freely cheat and have children on the side. And by just throwing his wife a hollow title and a bouquet of cheap flowers, he could erase all his sins. He wanted to have a beautiful and intelligent wife at home. And on the side, a submissive mistress, turning all the women around him into tools to serve his vanity and bottomless greed. I closed my book. I pushed the $20 bouquet to the edge of the table. I stood up, went to the console table under the television, and took out a leather-bound notebook and a pen. I returned to my seat, opened the notebook, and looked directly into Julian's eyes with the most serious and determined expression I had ever had. I told Julian clearly that this marriage was not a chess game where he could set the rules as he wished. If he wanted to talk again and resolve the problem, he had to meet my conditions. I quickly wrote them down on a clean sheet, reading each point aloud so he could hear them distinctly. First, the baptism banquet at the seafood restaurant was booked, and the guests were chosen by your family. Therefore, the $20,000 bill must be paid by your family out of their own pocket. I will not contribute a single cent. Second, all $10,000 in checks and gift cards that my friends, partners, and colleagues brought yesterday must be returned to me down to the last penny. Your family has no right to use my name for personal gain, stealing money from others to enrich themselves. Third, whoever gave birth to the child should raise him. And let them handle the paperwork at the county clerk's office themselves. Don't even think of using the excuse of a grandson heir to force me to take responsibility for my husband's mistress's bloodline. Fourth, and most importantly, from this moment on, I strictly forbid anyone from the Sterling family to bring up the topic of forcing me to be this child's mother. If these 4 conditions are not met, there is only one path: divorce through the court. Julian froze in his chair. His face clearly showed a mixture of astonishment and fear. He opened his mouth to object, but all arguments got stuck in his throat. My cold and clear proposals had shattered the illusion of a submissive, controllable wife he thought he had. He realized I was no longer a puppet whose strings his family could pull. The room filled with silence. All that remained was the heavy breathing of a man cornered by his own sins. I closed the notebook, stood up, and went straight to the bedroom, leaving him alone to chew on his belated and cheap remorse. The next morning, I took a day off from work. The stuffy air in the Brooklyn Heights apartment constricted my chest, and I found it hard to breathe. I hastily grabbed some clothes, threw them into a small travel bag, and took a taxi straight to an old 5-story building in the East Village, where my selfless mother waited for me every day. The building, touched by time, with peeling paint on the walls, the sound of a radio from one of the neighbors, and the familiar smell of home cooking. As I climbed the worn concrete steps, my heart suddenly calmed down. When the wooden door with its faded green paint opened, the image of my mother, Maria, bent over cleaning vegetables on the balcony, seemed strangely real and warm. Seeing me arrive in the middle of the week with a bag of belongings, a flicker of concern crossed my mother's eyes. But she quickly hid it. She didn't rush to ask what had happened. She just smiled gently and told me to put my things away, then come out and help her make a homemade chicken casserole, a dish I had always craved on holidays since childhood. My mother and I sat in the small kitchen. She had already prepared the ingredients for the casserole and soft mashed potatoes. My mother's thin hands, covered with age spots, skillfully layered the chicken, vegetables, and creamy sauce in the baking dish. I sat opposite, diligently helping with the preparation. The sound of the oven preheating, the rich smell of homemade food rose into the air, mingling to create an aroma of absolute peace. Without stopping her work, Maria spoke unhurriedly in the warm voice of a woman who had dedicated her life to sacrificing for her husband and children. She said she had brought me into the world and raised me day by day. Just by looking into my tired eyes, she knew a storm had broken in my married life. She didn't force me to tell the details. She just wanted to give me some life advice. My mother looked me straight in the eye and spoke softly to my soul. She told me that for a woman in marriage, knowing how to yield to keep peace in the family is a good thing. But sacrifice must be made for the right person and in the right place. Don't carry water for others to wash their hands in forever. If you do it for too long, not only will they not thank you, but they will also criticize you for not walking straight and spilling the water. Women can forgive inattention, but they absolutely should not bow their heads to betrayal and Machiavellian calculations. If this home has already grown cold, then have the courage to leave and come back here to your mother. We'll get by on bread and water, but we'll be together. Don't let your life burn out in humiliation. My mother's words were like a needle piercing the balloon of suppressed emotions that had been building up in me for days. I stopped helping with the food, buried my head in my knees, and sobbed bitterly. The tears rolled down my cheeks. These were not tears of weakness over regret for a bad man, but self-pity for a daughter who, after getting married, had been trampled and had now returned to seek refuge in her mother's protective embrace. My mother, in pain, set aside the spatula and hugged me. Her rough hand stroked my hair, comforting me. The warmth of her embrace transmitted an invisible strength to me. Lunch that day consisted only of a warm plate of chicken casserole and a fresh garden salad, but it was the most delicious food I had eaten in the last 5 years. I served my mother the best portion, telling myself that the days of enduring darkness were over. From tomorrow, I would stand firmly on my own 2 feet. I would sweep out the garbage of the past to build a new, brighter, and freer life with my own hands. My mother's food healed the deep wounds in my soul, arming me with the courage needed to face the final battles and sever all ties with the Sterling family. After the warm lunch and my mother's profound advice, I felt a huge internal relief. The invisible boulder that had been pressing on my chest all these days seemed to be completely lifted. I asked my mother's permission to stay a little longer, then took a taxi back to the apartment in Brooklyn Heights to prepare for the upcoming workdays. Crying or lamenting at this point would not solve a single problem. The most important thing was to keep a cool head and a strong heart to save my own life. That evening, as I sat at my desk organizing some personal documents, my tablet screen lit up. A message came from Anna, my friend who managed the restaurant. Anna sent me a link to a social media post, accompanied by a brief message insisting that I click on it immediately and see the true face of the man I was married to. I followed the link. The browser quickly redirected me to the official LinkedIn page of the advertising agency where Julian worked. It was a large company that placed great importance on image and corporate culture. The latest post on their main page was a long article honoring outstanding employees of the past quarter. The first thing that caught my eye was a very familiar photograph, enlarged and placed in the most prominent spot. It was a photo Julian and I had taken during our trip for our 4th wedding anniversary to Newport, Rhode Island last year. In the photo, Julian was in a flawless white shirt, smiling radiantly, and holding me very affectionately by the waist, creating a scene of a perfect and happy family. Below the photo, the agency's staff used very laudatory words to praise Julian. They placed a very large headline, Department Head Julian Sterling, a model family man, an excellent balance between work and home. The content of the article endlessly praised him as a talented leader, dedicated to his work, but always able to make time to care for his wife and family. They quoted moralistic phrases Julian had said in company meetings. For example, that the foundation of a strong career is a happy family, and that a successful man is one who never makes his wife cry. The post had garnered hundreds of likes and comments from colleagues, partners, and even clients of the company. Everyone was congratulating him, expressing admiration for his character and exemplary lifestyle. Reading every line on the screen, I felt nauseated. Julian's hypocrisy and audacity had reached a level I could not have imagined. He used my image. He used our crumbling marriage as a springboard for his own career advancement. He had built a flawless moral facade to win the favor of his superiors and subordinates, while in reality, he was a shameless traitor who secretly kept a mistress and had an illegitimate child. He used his reputation as a model husband to hide his selfish and extremely greedy nature. I sat in silence for a while, connecting all the events. Julian had always been proud of his position as department head. He was also aiming for the deputy director post in the year-end appointments. For a company that placed such a huge emphasis on the ethics and lifestyle of its leadership, a perfect family image was the most important ticket. Conversely, a love scandal that violated the principles of a monogamous marriage would undoubtedly be a fatal blow that would destroy the entire career he had worked so hard to build. I realized that Julian's biggest weakness was not the fear of losing me, nor the fear of his mother being upset. Most of all, he feared losing his prestige, losing his powerful position in the office, and his colleagues exposing the facade of hypocrisy he had tried so hard to maintain. He preferred to crawl on his knees, begging for forgiveness. He preferred to buy a $20 bouquet of flowers to placate me. All this was just to keep the waters calm, to protect his beautiful social image at all costs. Knowing this weakness, I did not hesitate for a second. I carefully used a program to take screenshots of the entire LinkedIn post, from the photo and the content of the article to every laudatory comment from people. I saved everything in a folder with a secure password on my computer, and also made a backup in the cloud to ensure maximum security. These images were not a tool for blackmail or threats, but they would become the strongest shield to protect me in the upcoming divorce battle. They would become the most convincing evidence to crush any attempt to distort the facts if he dared to change his story, play the victim, or slander me before the court. Looking at the newly created folder of documents, I smiled faintly. Everything was falling into place. The Sterling family's farce was nearing its end. 2 days had passed since the frank conversation with Julian. The air in the house was as cold as a block of ice. Julian tried to leave early and come back late to avoid me. Or perhaps he was busy running around to borrow money to pay the restaurant bill and deal with the fallout with his mistress, Claire. I didn't care about his existence either. I maintained my usual rhythm of life, went to work, came home, cooked for myself, and spent time on self-care. On Friday evening, as I was enjoying a cup of chamomile tea and watching the news program on TV, my phone notified me of a message. The sender was Aunt Carol, the direct neighbor who lived wall-to-wall with my mother-in-law in Queens. Since the scandal with the mistaken sending of the gift list a few days ago, Aunt Carol was the only one in the family who had spoken up in my defense and publicly criticized Lorraine's greed. I opened the message to see. Aunt Carol had sent me a video of about 2 minutes, accompanied by a voice message full of indignation. In her powerful voice, she told me to watch the video immediately so my eyes would be open to my mother-in-law's vileness. She explained that she had accidentally recorded this video last week in the courtyard of the local community center. At that moment, she was just about to film her friends doing gymnastics and didn't expect to capture a gossiping Lorraine. Yesterday, while clearing her phone's memory, she was reviewing files and was startled to find it, so she immediately sent it to me as proof. I pressed the play button on the video, the sound of loud dance music mixed with the chatter of women's conversations. The scene unfolded in the lounge area of the local country club, where my mother-in-law often went for Zumba classes in the evenings. In the corner of the frame, Lorraine, dressed in a fuchsia tracksuit, sat comfortably on a plush sofa. She held an iced tea in her hand, and her face was lifted with a look of complete self-satisfaction. 3 or 4 elderly women were gathered around her. They leaned toward Lorraine to listen to the gossip. Lorraine's voice came through Aunt Carol's phone microphone incredibly clearly. She slapped the fan against her thigh and raised her voice, boasting about her achievement. Lorraine clearly told her friends that the fact that her son Julian had a child on the side was absolutely nothing to hide, that it was a blessing for the Sterling family. She categorically stated that it didn't matter to her who gave birth, as long as the child carried Sterling blood and was a grandson heir to continue the family line. One woman in the group asked, intrigued, how the daughter-in-law at home would take it. Hearing the question, Lorraine burst into a long laugh and answered directly. She beat her chest, confidently declaring that her daughter-in-law was very kind and submissive. And that, moreover, since she had been married for 5 years without children, she was always at a disadvantage. She explained her plan in detail, saying that she would throw a very large party to present her with a fait accompli. She would use the pressure from relatives and numerous guests to force me to accept the child. She was sure that with my submissive character, I would obediently agree to raise this illegitimate son, both to preserve the family's prestige and to maintain my position as the wife of a department head. The video ended with a shot of Lorraine laughing loudly, accepting her friend's praises for her shrewdness and skill in managing her daughter-in-law. The phone screen went dark, but my mother-in-law's words, sharp as a razor, continued to ring in my ears. A chill ran down my spine from the cruelty and cunning of the woman I had respectfully called Mom for 5 years. So, everything was laid bare. Julian's excuse of a drunken accident was completely destroyed. The appearance of an illegitimate child was not an impulsive act of my husband, but a carefully calculated conspiracy with the active support and enthusiastic encouragement of his own mother. They had conspired step by step to lure me into a trap, treating me like an inanimate chess piece on the board of the Sterling family's interests. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress the anger that was about to explode in my chest. I carefully downloaded the video to my phone, then made a copy on my laptop and sent it to the cloud to ensure absolute security. This was the final detail and, at the same time, the most lethal blow that would end this rotten farce. With the secretly recorded video as irrefutable proof in my hands, I was completely confident as I entered the decisive battle at the Sterling family home the next day. Despite Aunt Carol's strong opposition and the whispers of relatives after the gift list incident in the family chat, Lorraine stubbornly insisted on seeing things through. She announced that she would host a family lunch at the large house in Queens to officially introduce the grandson to the family. This act of Lorraine's showed that she was trying to use her authority as the family elder to suppress opposing opinions and simultaneously force me to bend my head and accept the bitter truth. On Sunday at noon, the New York sun was scorching. I did not hide at all, but decided to attend with my head held high. I chose an elegant turquoise silk dress, gathered my hair into a high bun, and applied sophisticated makeup with bright red lipstick to emphasize my pride and authority. I carried my designer handbag, which contained all the weapons I had carefully prepared. I calmly took a taxi and went straight to the Sterling family home. When I stepped through the tall wooden gates of the house, the large yard was already full of people. Almost all the faces of the uncles and aunts who had been in the chat a few days ago were gathered here. The atmosphere in the yard was a bit stuffy and tense. The buzz of conversation suddenly died down. When I appeared, gazes of curiosity, apprehension, and even pity were fixed on me. Inside the main living room, Lorraine sat majestically on the sofa, holding the newborn. Right next to her stood my sister-in-law Janice, giving orders to the helpers to set the table, while Julian stood with his head bowed, pouring wine for the elder family members. When they saw me enter with a radiant and confident demeanor, the smile on Lorraine's lips faltered for a moment. Julian, out of nervousness, spilled some wine on the wooden table, not knowing where to hide his trembling hands. I remained composed, politely greeted the elders, and then addressed them in a soft but very clear voice. I asked for the attendees' permission to say a word before the family started eating because there were some murky matters that needed to be clarified right now. Lorraine cleared her throat, trying to stop me, but Uncle Robert raised a hand, sternly telling her to be quiet and let me speak. I opened my bag and took out the first paper, the bill from the seafood restaurant for $20,000. I walked over and placed the bill directly on the coffee table in front of Julian and Lorraine. I stated firmly before the entire family that the grand celebration a few days ago was booked and the guests were invited personally by my husband's family. I attended as a guest and had already given my gift. Therefore, this $20,000 debt lies on the conscience of Julian and my mother-in-law. I demanded that the family pay the bill from their own pocket, ending the illusion that they could force me to use my card to pay for my husband's infidelity. Julian lowered his head, not daring to answer. Lorraine turned purple with anger, but before she could react, I delivered the second blow. I continued, pulling out a stack of neatly stapled papers from my bag. It was a detailed copy of the gift logbook that I had recreated the previous night based on the photo Janice had mistakenly sent. I respectfully handed a copy to the eldest uncle and Aunt Carol for them to pass around. I explained clearly that on the list of collections from that day, there was about $10,000 in cash from the envelopes of my friends, colleagues, and partners, whom I had personally invited at my mother-in-law's command. At first, my mother-in-law promised that she would return this money to her friend's family. But the truth, as everyone could see in the notebook, was that all this money had been shamelessly recorded by Janice and my mother-in-law into the family's expense fund to serve as personal capital for this child. I demanded that Janice and my mother-in-law immediately return the $10,000 gifted by my guests to me today. I will not allow anyone to use my honor to enrich themselves in such a despicable manner. The clear truth on paper heated the atmosphere in the house to a breaking point. It felt like everything was about to explode. Cornered, the greedy people began to attack each other. Janice, panicked, rushed to deny everything. She pointed directly at Lorraine's face, screaming in front of the whole family that she was only the one holding the pen to do the accounting. But in reality, all the thick envelopes from my colleagues, Lorraine had hidden in her personal bag to take home. She hadn't kept a single penny. Lorraine, hearing her own daughter accuse her, jumped up as if stung by a wasp. She completely dropped the facade of a respectable mother-in-law, loudly insulting Janice, calling her a thief, claiming she had taken the collected money to pay her own debts, and was now turning to falsely accuse her mother. The sterling mother and daughter, the very ones who had once joined hands to conspire and harm me, now stood in the middle of the family living room, insulting and attacking each other. Just for the sake of avoiding responsibility for returning ill-gotten gains, the elder family members shook their heads. Sighs of disappointment echoed throughout the house. The Sterling family's mask of hypocrisy was officially torn off in a humiliating and shameful manner. I crossed my arms and watched the chaotic scene with a slight, cold smile on my lips, waiting for the right moment to deliver the final, decisive blows and completely destroy this dirty alliance. The scene at the family home was truly chaotic and tragicomic. The shrill screams of Lorraine and Janice echoed throughout the house, completely destroying the solemn atmosphere of the family gathering. The surrounding relatives shook their heads in resignation. Some tried to intervene but could not extinguish the fire of greed consuming the motherly and daughterly love of these two women. In a far corner near the entrance, Claire held the newborn, hiding behind a pillar. Her face was pale. Her frightened eyes darted continuously from mother-in-law to sister-in-law. Perhaps at that moment, she was beginning to vaguely realize the true nature of the family she so desperately wanted to join. I did not rush to intervene in the money war between Lorraine and her daughter. I waited patiently until Uncle Robert slammed his hand hard on the table, shouting and demanding silence from everyone. His authority and position as the family's main financial backer made Lorraine and Janice fall silent, but their gazes continued to throw daggers. The space plunged into a tense silence. I took a deep breath. I reached into my bag and took out the second, most devastating weapon, saved especially for my husband's mistress. I held a carefully bound file in my hand and slowly approached Claire. I looked directly into her fear-filled eyes and spoke in a very clear and calm voice. I told Claire that in the coffee shop the other day I had warned her about this family's false promises, but perhaps she still held out hope. Today, with the whole family gathered, I will show you the proof so you can judge for yourself what position you hold in this calculated plan to obtain an heir. With that, I flipped the first page and placed it directly in Claire's hand. It was a housing lease agreement with all the signatures and official seals. I announced loudly to the entire family, and especially to Claire, that the luxury apartment on the Upper East Side that Julian had promised to use as a home for Claire and her son was actually just a short-term rental. The cancellation document was signed exactly 1 month ago, at the very moment Claire was pregnant and about to give birth, and Julian had taken the deposit refund and pocketed it himself. The paper in Claire's hand trembled. Her eyes widened at the sight of the bolded letters, clearly stating the lease term and the deposit amount. Tears began to roll down the haggard face of the woman who had just given birth. I did not stop. I delivered the final knife blow to completely sever the threads of their deceit. I went back to the coffee table, took my smartphone, and connected it to a small wireless speaker I had brought in my bag. I played the video that Aunt Carol had sent me 2 days ago. The image was not projected onto a large screen, but the sound filled every corner of the house. Loud dance music blared, followed by Lorraine's shrill and arrogant voice, coming at full volume from the small speaker. Lorraine's cruel words, asserting that it didn't matter who gave birth as long as the child carried sterling blood, and the plan to force me to raise the child while cruelly casting out the biological mother, destroyed all of this family's lies. The whole house fell silent. The wrinkled faces of the elders contorted with astonishment and indignation. Uncle Robert was so angry he was shaking. He pointed directly at Lorraine's face, insulting her, calling her a viper, saying she had corrupted the family's morals and brought disgrace to the entire respected family. Lorraine collapsed onto the sofa. There was not a drop of blood in her face. She covered her face with both hands, not daring to look at anyone. Julian fell to his knees on the floor, crying pitifully, clutching his head and continuously muttering meaningless apologies. Claire's heart-wrenching scream tore through the gloomy atmosphere. She threw the lease agreement in Julian's face, sobbing loudly. The exposed, cruel truth made her realize she was left with nothing. There was no luxury apartment, no savings account for the child, no status for her. She had been grandly deceived. The Sterling family had used her as a free tool, and only when her value was exhausted were they ready to cast her aside to force me to bear this cross, to clean up the mess of their bottomless greed. In her extreme indignation, no longer able to maintain her fake weakness, she loudly cursed Lorraine's cruelty and insulted Julian's cowardice and baseness. She categorically stated that the Sterling family would not get this grandson. She would rather take her son and beg on the streets than let him grow up in a family full of scammers and hypocrites. With that, Claire tightly clutched the baby, who was crying loudly in fear. She turned and ran out of the family home. The baby's cries grew distant and then were completely drowned out by the noise of the street traffic. The Sterling family was now in complete chaos. Lorraine screamed, calling for her grandson, trying to run to stop her, but her trembling legs gave way, and she fell face down on the floor in the yard. Janice, terrified of my threat of legal action, rushed to her bag and thrust all the checks and cash totaling $10,000 into my hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Julian sat stunned, like a lost soul. The dirty alliance built on vile calculations had officially shattered, leaving behind a shameful humiliation that could never be washed away in the eyes of the entire family. Securing the money my friends had gifted, I looked at the chaotic and tragic scene unfolding before my eyes, but not a drop of satisfaction or pity arose in my heart. Inside me at that moment was only the absolute calm of a person who has just passed through a great storm and is looking at the wreckage behind them. The only thing I wanted to do was to keep moving forward, to find a new, more peaceful land to start rebuilding from scratch. I slowly gathered the papers from the table, put the small speaker back in my bag, and then stood before the faces that clearly showed the astonishment and humiliation of my husband's family. I turned my gaze to Uncle Robert and the other elders. I gave a polite nod and then clearly spoke my farewell words. I declared before the elders that during the 5 years I was a daughter-in-law of the Sterling family, I had fulfilled my duty as a wife and daughter-in-law, never once being insolent or doing anything questionable. But the deceit, betrayal, and cruel conspiracy of my husband and my mother-in-law had exceeded the limit of what a person can endure. From this moment on, I officially sever all ties with the Sterling family. I will unilaterally file for divorce in court, demanding a transparent resolution of all financial matters. I am taking nothing that belongs to this family, and I also demand that you never intrude on my life again, not even once. Having said these final words, I turned and walked with a firm, wide stride through the yard. No one from my husband's family dared to call out to me, and no one had the courage to run after me to hold me back. The heavy wooden gates of the family home closed behind my back, forever separating two worlds. Behind those gates remained Lorraine's cries for her lost grandson, Janice's mutual disputes and accusations, and Julian's complete collapse upon realizing he had lost the most precious thing simply because of his greed and selfishness. Outside the gates, the autumn sky over the city was a piercing blue. The golden rays of the sun shone on the street, as if welcoming the return of a free soul. I took a taxi back to my apartment in Brooklyn Heights. This would be the last time I set foot on this threshold. I changed into comfortable clothes, took 2 large suitcases from the closet, and began to pack my personal belongings. I took no valuable jointly acquired property. I only packed the clothes I had bought with my own salary, a few favorite books, cosmetics, and items that held sentimental value only for me. The expensive jewelry my mother-in-law had given me on my wedding day, I carefully put back in their red velvet box and left on the dressing table. The bedroom where so many joys and sorrows of married life had accumulated was now empty and cold. I went out into the living room. My gaze accidentally fell on the glass coffee table. The bouquet of roses wrapped in cellophane for $20 that Julian had brought to ask for forgiveness. It had been lying there for several days, never put in water. The petals had already wilted and darkened. The leaves had fallen onto the table, looking pathetic and cheap. It was exactly like the love and remorse he felt for me. Fake, cheap, and quickly faded. I didn't throw the bouquet in the trash. I took this withered bouquet and placed it on the living room windowsill, right next to the set of keys to the apartment and the gold wedding ring I had just removed from my ring finger. This was my way of returning all the lies, wounds, and empty vows this man had given me. Rolling the 2 heavy suitcases out the door, I turned my head to look at the apartment one last time. There was no nostalgia, only a sigh of relief. I locked the door and then dropped the key into the mailbox, finally severing all emotional ties with the past. The sound of the suitcase wheels rolling on the sidewalk echoed in the sunny afternoon. I called a small moving van to go straight to a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, where I had just rented a small but peaceful apartment to start a completely new life. Not even a month had passed since that catastrophic family lunch when karma struck the Sterling family with powerful and brutal force, without any need for cruel revenge on my part. The laws of cause and effect in life automatically put everything in its place. After I left, Julian had to deal with the mountain of rubble he himself had created. The due date for the $20,000 bill from the seafood restaurant arrived. And, on top of that, the family's pressure to return the $10,000 from my guests' gift money put him in a desperate situation. Unable to borrow from anyone, Julian was forced to max out his credit cards to pay off the debts, saddling himself with huge monthly bank interest payments. Julian's career also went downhill. It's unclear how the story of the scandal in his personal life leaked out. It reached the ears of the company's management. For a company that valued its media image, the fact that a manager had exploited the company's platform to build a fraudulent public persona, while the ensuing public scandal drew negative attention from clients, was an unacceptable liability. Julian was summoned to the HR department for disciplinary action. He was immediately removed from his position as department head and transferred to the position of a regular employee in a less important department. The facade of a model man had shattered. He became the subject of gossip and ridicule from his colleagues. He went to work every day with his head bowed in shame. As for Claire, having realized the true nature of the Sterling family, she took the child and went straight back to her hometown in upstate New York. Claire's parents were furious that their daughter had been deceived. They declared that they strictly forbid anyone with the Sterling name from setting foot there to visit or acknowledge the grandchild. At home, Lorraine missed her grandson to the point of madness, but she also didn't dare go to Claire's town to demand him because she knew that the relatives there would chase her away with sticks. Since the day the scandal broke, Lorraine had also lost face with her neighbors. Aunt Carol and the neighbors often whispered and criticized her immoral behavior. Too ashamed, Lorraine locked herself at home for days, completely giving up her habit of going to the community center to dance or gossip with her friends. One weekend evening, it was raining cats and dogs in the city. I was standing, waiting for a taxi under the awning of a supermarket near my work. A drenched male figure rushed toward me. It was Julian. He looked haggard, with several days' worth of stubble, and his eyes were glazed over with despair. Despite the lashing cold rain, Julian stood before me with a trembling voice, begging me to give him a chance to start over. He said he had lost everything, and now he only had me as his last lifeline. I looked at the man who was once my husband with a calm heart, in which there was not a single ripple. I did not mock his pathetic state or reproach him for his past mistakes. I calmly opened my light blue umbrella to shield myself from the splashing rain and spoke in a very calm voice. I advised him to pick himself up by his own strength. The consequences he himself had created, he was obligated to bear them to the end. I told him that the greatest forgiveness I could give him now was to free us both, so that no one would have to carry the burden of resentment for the rest of their life. A new page has been turned in my life, and on that page, there is absolutely no room to write his name. With that, I got into the taxi that had just stopped, leaving Julian standing under a wall of white rain. The car took me back to my small rented apartment. The apartment was small but filled with natural light and very cozy. I changed into dry clothes, sat at the small wooden table by the window, and carefully took out a notebook to record the monthly expenses of my new home. With the salary I earned myself, and having personally returned every single envelope to my friends and colleagues with a sincere apology for my ex-husband's ridiculous scheme, I felt freer and happier than ever before. I reached for the bouquet of pink lilies I had bought for myself that afternoon. I carefully arranged them in a ceramic vase in the center of the table. The scent of the lilies spread throughout the room, dispelling the cold of the rain outside. I went out onto the balcony, cut a few sprigs of fresh mint that Aunt Carol had brought me in a small pot last week. I brought them inside to brew a pot of hot tea. Holding a cup of softly fragrant mint tea, I looked out at the bustling street with its lights through the window glass. My soul felt light, serene, and surprisingly calm. Having passed through a broken marriage full of wounds and scratches, I did not let myself break or lose faith in life. I realized that the best forgiveness is not trying to glue together the broken pieces, but understanding one's own worth, having the courage to climb out of the mud to heal and love oneself. I took a sip of hot tea, smiling freely, ready to welcome the bright dawns that lay ahead. All the storms had subsided, leaving me with a clear sky and a life that truly belonged to me.